Hi, welcome to our life group series on Ephesians. This is session 6, and today we're looking at Ephesians chapter 5. Now, as with our previous sessions, if you haven't had a chance yet to read through the chapter in your life group, then I want to encourage you just to pause this video and read through it before we begin. Now, in chapter 5, Paul continues the instructions that he started to give us in chapter 4. Now, you may remember that in chapter 4, we just quickly re-highlighted something that we looked at in the introduction, which is this idea that in chapters 1 to 3, Paul addresses our heavenly calling. And then in chapters 4 to 6, Paul looks at our earthly conduct. Here in chapter 5, we have an important reminder that these are not two kind of separate realities, but that they are intrinsically linked. That it's not as if God has done all these amazing things for us and then steps back from the world and says, okay, guys, over to you. And then in chapters 4 to 6, Paul says, okay, well, this is what you've got to do to maintain this way of living. But instead, that chapters 4 to 6 is about what our participation in all that God has already done looks like. So, for example, at the beginning of chapter 5, Paul encourages us to walk in the way of love like Christ has loved us. We read in those early chapters of Ephesians about how Christ has loved us. We're told that Christ has blessed us and chosen us and destined us and lavished his grace upon us, etc., etc. And so as we look to live out our Christian calling, and as we look to live out and participate in the ways of love, we can look back to those early chapters and recognize that this is what we're participating in. And Paul continues to just highlight different aspects of this calling and what God has done, so that it's not just like these two separate things, but it's an expression of the calling, the way that we live. And so we're invited not just to apply everything we learned in chapters 1 to 3, but we're to participate in the life that God has made possible. Eugene Peterson puts it this way, that we have been in on this with God from the beginning, and God will be in on this with us to the very end. I love that in those first, you might remember back in chapter 1, when we looked at Ephesians chapter 1, there was no commands, there was no verbs for us to do anything. It was all things that God has done for us, including that God had destined us from the beginning of time. But then we are now being told in chapters 4 to 6 about how we are to participate, not separate from God, but with God with us to the very end. So with that in mind, let's start to look at chapter 5 a bit more in depth. We're told by Paul in verse 1 that we are to follow God's example. Or as other translations put it, and I love how these other translations put this, that we are to be imitators of God. We read of Jesus in the Gospels, in particular in John's Gospel, where Jesus regularly says, I only do what I see the Father doing. That Jesus acts as an imitator of God. Now, we of course know that Jesus was God, God incarnate, God in the flesh. But Jesus was an imitator of God, and he spent time with God to enable him to be able to be an imitator of him. He knew his Father intimately, and we are called to do the same. That we are to watch what God does and do things his way. What will this look like? This will require time and effort. Spending time with God in prayer, spending time with God in the scriptures, studying his character in the scriptures too. We highlighted last time in chapter 4 in our session 5 that maturity is a theme in Ephesians. And that Paul says this is actually one of the goals of the Christian faith, to reach maturity and to grow into the fullness of Jesus Christ, that we are to mature. There's a danger that we could try to translate maturity as doing more things for God, increasing the amount of things that we do for God. But a better definition of maturity would be more action with God. Seeing God reflected in more of our lives, in every aspect of our lives, in the day-to-day living of our lives, which I think is why Paul starts to unpack what this looks like, this participation in the life that God has made possible, why he unpacks what that looks like in our households, in our marriages, with our children, in chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6, because that's what maturity in the Christian life looks like. More action with God, not just more action for God. Paul then, after giving us instruction to imitate God and to walk in the way of love just as Christ loves us, then tells us things that we are not to do. that we're to stay away from sexual immorality, any kind of impurity, greed, or foul or obscure talk. And these are important things for us to talk about, I think, because sometimes we're in danger of doing two opposite things. That we're in danger of making these things so legalistic that we end up purely pointing the finger at others and becoming very judgmental, a bit like the Pharisees that we read about in the Gospels. Or we're so scared of being like that, we're so scared of being legalistic that we avoid discussing these things at all. But these things are not lists simply of just do nots, some things that have been plucked out of the air, but these are things that are incompatible with the life that God has called us to live. These are things that are incompatible if we want to walk in the way of love. These are incompatible if we want to be imitators of God. We cannot partake of these things. We have a new identity now, Paul says in verse 1 of chapter 5, that we are dearly beloved children. And to do these things, sexual immorality, impurity, greed, foul or obscure talk, is incompatible with this identity that we have received, incompatible with this resurrection life, our new identity in Christ. And so we are called to countercultural living. And we are to make concerted effort to stay away from these things that Paul instructs us to. That we are make a concerted effort to improve and to be more Christ-like in these areas. And they were as relevant today as they were to the culture back then. The three areas that Paul highlights are sexual immorality, the spending of our money, and healthy speech ethics. That actually, if we want to imitate God, if we want to walk in the way of love, then we need to have a healthy sexual ethic. We need to have healthy ethics on how we spend our money, and we need to have healthy speech ethics. How we talk to one another, how we talk about one another needs to change and be healthy. Now, just highlighting those three things, that sounds so simple, but we know that actually living pure lives in these three areas is very difficult. Imagine how we would see our world change if these three areas were more Christ-like. This is how our light is to shine. But it's important that we highlight this is grounded not just in our effort. This is not just about us doing more for God. It's about doing more with God. And so we spend time in prayer and reading scripture and asking God to help us on the way. But also Paul puts these little hints throughout the chapter to show us this is about your time with God. And it's God who will help you achieve these things. In verse 1, he says we need to imitate God. In verse 10, we're told that we should find out what pleases the Lord. And in verse 17, we're told that we should find out what the Lord's will is. So it's not just that there's, hey, here's these lists of do nots, put them on your wall and do all you can not to do them. But instead, spend time with God, discover what pleases him, discover what his will is, imitate him. And as a result, it will be so much easier in our concerted efforts in those three areas. And so doing these things, pursuing God and making a concerted effort in these areas, stepping away from the ways of the world and starting to walk in the way of love, will lead to a life defined by wisdom and by the Spirit of God who is there to help us. Now, Paul, in the center of all of that, highlights this idea of light. And he says, you are children of light. He goes back to our identity, our heavenly calling to say, hey, this is now who you are. And therefore, you need to participate in this life by living differently, living counterculturally. And so our new identity includes ridding ourselves of these immoral, dark things. But we're also called to expose the deeds of darkness. That actually in the life of the church, one of the things that we do is we seek to participate and practice this and learn this together in community. Not pointing the finger, not shaming others, not kind of having a go and criticizing others, but helping each other to walk in the way of love. And we do so with the motivation of love. So we highlight perhaps at times and speak to people who are maybe struggling with these areas, not because we're disgusted at them, not because we're ashamed of them and we want them to sort their lives out, but instead because we love them and we want to walk in the way of love with them. And we want to help them achieve maturity, a life with God too. Paul then quotes this passage. He says, wake up, O sleeper, this kind of hymn that was obviously known in the church. He says, we are to wake up to the ways of this world, that we're to be raised from the dead and live a resurrection life. You may remember I challenged us to think about if we perhaps died and then come back to life again, how we'd have a new sense of life, that we'd change the way that we live. And that's what Paul is encouraging us to do here, that we are to wake up from the dead, that we're to be raised to a new resurrection life. And we're told that when we start to do this, that we will receive grace and strength from God. Why? Because Christ will shine on us. So how do we live a resurrection life? We imitate God and we walk in the ways of love as shown by Christ. And once we embrace these things, we're then encouraged by Paul to remember to meet in community and to worship. We're better than to practice and learn the ways of God and the way of love. We're better to be God imitators than in the church. This is our starting place. This is where we learn to grow in these ways of love. Then we come to this section on instruction on Christian households. Now, just as a bit of a recap, Paul says several things in Ephesians chapter 5, like follow God's example, live a life of love, live as children of light, be careful how you live, be filled with the Spirit. And so we have to remember that to do these things has a tangibility. These aren't pie in the sky things. These are actually day-to-day things that we can seek to do. And so how do we participate in the mystery of God, as Paul talks about in Ephesians? We do so in our day-to-day living and including in our relationships. And so Paul begins by looking in chapter 5 at marriages. Now, I don't want to go into the full details of this because it would take way too long, but just to highlight a couple of things around marriage. Now, with marriage in the Roman times, there were two extremes that were beginning to happen. The first was that marriage was male-dominated. Now, this meant that the men in the relationship had the legal and social power over his wife, his children, and his slaves, complete and utter control. Now, there's some Christians who would perhaps support this, but it's not the biblical way. The second extreme that was happening was kind of a protest response to this male-dominated world. And women started wanting to free themselves from this control. And in particular, in a place like Ephesus, which was very female-dominated. See, the main temple in Ephesus was a temple to Artemis, who had female priestesses and was a female god. And so the emphasis was on female rights. And so the women started to express this freedom by removing their head coverings, which was a sign that they were married, by dressing provocatively, by sleeping around and using abortion as birth control. Now, in response to this second way, we know that Caesar Augustus had to issue decrees to promote the traditional family unit because the birth rate in the Roman Empire was beginning to drop. Now, that obviously has an impact on the economy and on armies and on all sorts. And so there were these two extremes, male-dominated living, female independence, trying to pursue this different way of living. And so Paul speaks into this context, which was happening in Ephesus. He speaks into it and he says, hey guys, let me like this. I know what's happening with marriage. I know it's a bit confused. There's these two different ways of thinking, but let me speak in and tell you what Christ says. Let me tell you what it looks like to participate in the mystery of Christ. It starts with mutual submission. Mutual submission. Now, the word submit in our culture doesn't have really positive connotations, but back then it was a real term of reverence and respect. Submission as you would have to a warrior would have to a commander. Submission as a good citizen would have to a good leader. And so we, as Christians, in our relationships and in our marriages, are called to lay down our own self-interests. Paul then goes on to instruct wives to submit to husbands. He was calling wives to live counterculturally based on their relationship with Jesus. Now, this isn't calling wives to have blind obedience or making the husband the boss, but instead this is saying, actually, I want you to live differently. I want you not to pursue your own self-interests. I want you to put the interests of others in mind. I want you to walk in the way of love, imitating God. And then we're told what the husband is to do, that the husband is called to love the wife as Christ loved the church. You see, far from making the husband the boss, this places a greater sacrificial responsibility on the husband's shoulders. So in this teaching on husbands and wives and marriage, what I think Paul is doing is he was tackling these two extremes which were present in the Roman world at that time, and in particular in Ephesus. He was tackling the independence and control that women were pursuing and saying, no, submission is the better way of living. Put other people first. But I also think he was tackling the desire for power and the laziness and the self-centeredness of men. I think that both of those extremes can be seen in our culture today. And the answer is mutual submission. I heard it said recently that it needs to be a submission contest. That between husbands and wives, they should aim to submit to one another. Do you know that time when you get to a door and someone opens it and you say, after you, no, after you, no, after you? That's what our marriages should be like, that we should seek to submit to one another. So when I speak to married couples, my suggestion to them is that they discuss what this will look like in their day-to-day living. Not just in the big and the grand gestures that take place every now and then, but in everyday living. What does it look like to submit to one another? What will mutual submission look like in your day-to-day living? Perhaps if you're a married couple, you could list 5 ways that you could do that together. Or perhaps separately you want to list those 5 ways and come together and discuss them. So that's marriage covered. And actually in our next session together, our final session in chapter 6, we continue looking at household and parents and children. But remember that initial command for each of us to submit to one another is not just for married couples, it's for all of us in all of our relationships. So there's an application for us all. So in this session, we've covered quite a lot. Paul encourages us that we are now children of the light, dearly loved children who are called to be imitators of God, living countercultural lives that are defined by wisdom and the Holy Spirit. The best place for us to learn to live this way is in community, as we worship together, placing Jesus at the centre of all that we do. And this includes our families. In a world where we are so often out to serve our own self-interest, we are called to mutual submission, where wives place their husbands first and husbands love their wives as Christ loved the church. So as I said, next session is our final session, looking at chapter 6 of Ephesians. Going to be continuing looking at the household, also looking at the armour of God and the final exhortation that Paul gives as well. Excited for that. Look forward to seeing you for session 7. See you next time.